A Chinese team of scientists have found a new bat coronavirus that, quote, could infect humans via the same route as COVID-19. Here is the article that announced the information. This is from the South China Morning Post, and they allege that the same cleavage sites that COVID-19 used have now been found in a new version of a coronavirus, leading some people to compare this newly discovered coronavirus to MERS, which is a deadly Middle East respiratory syndrome. We've got to talk about exactly this new discovery. Is this a big deal? Is it something we need to pay attention to? And what concerns are there related to the potential for human transmission or another pandemic? Let's first and foremost start with the facts. All right, let's get started. The first thing that we need to know is what this new virus is and why we should care. So there is something known as the HKU5 coronavirus variant. It was actually identified in 2006, guess where? In Hong Kong, and guess in what? Bats. Now, the HKU5 was only able to replicate in certain conditions in a lab setting, and it was really thought to transmit only from bat to bat. So we've known about HKUs for about 19 years. Now we see a new variant of this HKU5 coronavirus. It is called HKU5-CoV-2. Kind of like SARS-CoV-2. This is HKU5-CoV-2. It's the new variant, and it uses the same ACE2 receptors, or has the same receptors that SARS-CoV-2 did. Now, why that matters is because those same receptors enable what's called this like furin cleavage site in the spike protein. It basically makes it easier for the virus to infect cells in humans and invade those cells and take them over. After all, that's what viruses do. The thing is, the first HKU virus didn't do this. It was never really capable of, in an observable manner, transmitting between either animals or humans, though again, we believe it transmitted between bats. It was really only able to replicate in a lab under certain conditions with certain ideal ingredients added. After all, this is what researchers do, and Dr. Scott Gottlieb is a little frustrated that there's a potential that this research is being conducted at the Wuhan Institute for Virology, which, yeah, that's where the first COVID leaked from, as now the CIA has stated, the FBI has stated, and the internet knew about since basically it happened. But anyway, people are making a comparison to HKU-CoV-2, basically. HKU5-CoV-2. They're making a comparison between this and MERS, the Middle East respiratory virus. That's because the Middle East respiratory virus had a 35% death rate, which is really bad. That's extremely high. So in other words, you had a 1 in 3 chance of dying if you got MERS. But what they don't talk about, or most people don't talk about regarding this beyond just fear-mongering, is that MERS wasn't highly transmissible to humans. In fact, there was no evidence of human-to-human transmission at all. In fact, one of the reasons they called it the Middle East virus was because the only way you could get it was from riding a freaking camel. Yeah, it was able to transmit from camels to humans, but there's no indication that it actually transmitted from humans to humans, and so therefore MERS never actually sustained community spread. Even though MERS is quite bad, it basically died with its host, or if its host survived and the virus went away within the host, then the virus was gone. Now, the big news here, excuse me, sorry, just got back from Wuhan and didn't wear a mask. Gotta wash those hands. Anyway, what's important here is, or the discovery, or the news this morning, is really just that the same receptor, that spike protein modification that we saw in SARS-CoV-2, is the same kind of modification that we now see in HKU5-CoV-2. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean it's automatically going to transfer to humans, because we don't actually know how stable HKU5-CoV-2 is in the natural environment. Yes, it was found in bats, and yes, it was introduced to human-like tissue in a lab that suggests it could transmit to humans. And of course, if it were to transmit to humans, it would be a very bad thing. And Dr. Scott Gottlieb is right in suggesting that there is a risk that this is being studied under biosafety level 2 conditions rather than higher biosafety levels, which is possibly how the first lab leak occurred when it came to COVID. And we've made videos on all of this on the channel, but just to give you a quick preview, when we were studying SARS-CoV-2, a lot of it was done under a biosafety level 2 standard, which a level 2 standard is, I'll show you an example here on screen, is really just a face mask and maybe an N95 or a KN95 if you're in China, because those are the Chinese made ones. This is in contrast to a biosafety level 4 suit, which has positive pressure, basically pressurizes your suit and pushes out respiratory particles or prevents them from coming in, while obviously being in some kind of sealed and taped up unit. This, again, these are very, very different biosafety levels, and one of the problems with SARS-CoV-2 was that research was conducted under a level 2 biosafety level, which isn't great because it does increase the risk that you could potentially get essentially contaminated and become sick with the very virus that you are studying. And if then that virus is capable of transmitting from you to another human, which of course COVID was, well, then you can have a rapid explosion of COVID spread. Coronaviruses, mind you, have been studied for many, many decades, mostly because they're also associated with the common cold. Every time you have the common cold, you basically have a form of a coronavirus in you. And it's one of the reasons why people suggest that today the coronavirus has basically depreciated to something similar to the level of a common cold. It's because they kind of all just devolve into the common cold. That doesn't mean it was a common cold when it first came around. See, COVID evolved into various different variants. When it was first released, possibly from directed evolution, where you take, a sick monkey, get another monkey sick, and then you take the sickest of the next batch of 5 monkeys, let's say, and you get the next set of 5 sick, and then you take the sickest one of those 5, and you get the next one sick, right? You're directing the evolution of the sickest variants out into the wild. And then if somebody else gets sick with this highly virulent sickness, well, then of course it can cause a pandemic. Now, eventually, that decays and it becomes sort of a normal coronavirus, which would be like a common cold. And that's roughly what we've seen happen with COVID. So yes, it was really bad. It even got worse before it got better with Delta. But what you saw was, as soon as the spread became even faster, where it became more like an Omicron and more common cold-like, its lethality actually started declining. And so the expectation is that in order for something to really escape from a lab and cause a pandemic, it has to not only be deadly, but it has to be able to spread very, very rapidly. And so look, I'm not happy about the Wuhan Institute of Virology, or whatever, virology, once again messing around with coronaviruses and conducting research with, potentially, or maybe in the olden days, leftover U.S. taxpayer-funded dollar hollers. But I will say I'm not going to lose sleep over this because I feel like the odds of this transmitting to a human are very, very low outside of ideal lab conditions. The first variant didn't, and just because we have this cleavage site modification, I don't think necessarily suggests that's it. Now all of a sudden it is capable of transmitting to a human in normal human-like circumstances. I feel like that's a little bit more of a lottery for a virus to actually accomplish. Now, it can happen. Obviously, we saw it during 2020. And it's one of the reasons why today we saw vaccine maker stocks actually go up, despite the fact that the market was pretty dang red today. Most of the market was pretty dang red. And when this news started breaking out, you started seeing stocks like Pfizer go up. It was actually green today, up 1.5%. Moderna was up about 5% today. And these are stocks that have been bleeding out for a while, and they picked up on this news. Because, of course, Moderna and Pfizer were involved in the mRNA vaccines and blah, 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 blah. So I think this news is mostly overblown. Is it something that we want to pay attention to? Of course. Is there a possibility there could be another pandemic? Abso-freaking-lutely. And there probably will be at some point in the future again, because at some point in the future, all the doinking around that we do with nature will lead to that lottery again for the virus. I'm not saying for humans it's a lottery, it's for the virus it's a lottery. That rare chance that it actually ends up breaking out, being sustainable in nature, that is, it survives in nature long enough to infect a host like a human, and then be very contagious and be deadly. A lot of these factors are just quite rare for a virus to be able to accomplish. And then even when they do, they tend to, not always, they tend to fade into lower level drugs or lower level issues, or we have longer term vaccinations against them, right? Like polio, for example, right? That never decayed in society. It actually continued to be a problem, hence a vaccination against it. And I'm not here to shill for vaccination or whatever. I'm here simply to say that, at least from the research that I'm able to conduct at this point, this doesn't seem like something I want to lose sleep about. Now, Dr. Scott Gottlieb, which, look, he doesn't give me the most confidence either, because I kind of get chills and nightmares of his face on CNBC during COVID, but he argues that it's pretty routine to identify these sort of lab changes, and that and they come from bats all of the time, and he's not concerned by this. He calls this not common. He didn't really provide much color beyond that, and only really complained about why is Wuhan still operating with a BSL level 2. I don't know if that's true. The Wuhan Institute of Virology is a level 4 institution, but just like a maximum security prison, you have different levels within the institution. So they probably have level 2 chambers, level 3 chambers, and level 4 chambers. And maybe Dr. Scott Gottlieb has some research that actually suggests they are doing this research in a level 2. They did, after all, with SARS-CoV-2, so maybe he's onto something. But this idea that this is going to jump into humans and it's going to kill everybody like MERS did, and it's going to be a really, really deadly virus, that just like that camel virus was, I don't buy it. So again, I'm not trying to like cast it aside, but I just want to always be that sort of at least initial voice of reason, and if I'm wrong, I'll make another video talking about it. But I'm a big fan of doing whatever research I can, and this is what I was able to find out at this point, and hopefully it gives you a head start in your research. But am I worried about HKU5-CoV-2? No, not at all. And if that's what caused the market to sell off today, then I'll be a buyer.
Why not advertise these things that you told us here? I feel like nobody else knows about this.
We'll try a little advertising and see how it goes.
Congratulations, man. You have done so much. People love you. People look up to you.
Kevin Paffrath there, financial analyst and YouTuber. Meet Kevin. Always great to get your take.